Yesterday, 11 seconds of audio captured on a hot microphone in France completely rewrote the public narrative of the North American trade war. It didn't land via a carefully managed press release from Ottawa, and it certainly wasn't meant to survive the editing room. Instead, it slipped through a live broadcast feed at a working lunch during the G7 Leaders Summit in Evian-les-Bains. Mark Carney leaned across a white tablecloth, made a sharp horizontal cutting motion with his hand, and laid out the precise mechanics of Canada's controversial electric vehicle deal directly to Donald Trump. "Less than 3% of our market, 49,000 cars," Carney murmured. "A cap. We capped. A hard line." Then came the sentence currently reverberating through trade offices from Washington to Beijing. "I thought you'd actually like that." Trump's response was immediate, unedited, and entirely stripped of his trademark tariff bravado. "That's good. I like it." This is not a routine diplomatic leak. This is a rare, unscripted look at the hidden architecture of international trade diplomacy, revealing that the public theatre of economic warfare rarely matches the reality of private negotiations. For 5 months, the public was told that Canada was on the precipice of economic ruin, facing triple-digit retaliatory tariffs from an enraged Washington. This hot mic reveals that the rage was a performance. To understand how a single 11-second exchange undercuts an entire year of geopolitical posturing, we have to look at the timeline that brought both leaders to that lunch table in France. This is a highly sequenced political and diplomatic operation, and the chronology reveals exactly who was playing for the cameras and who was playing for the board. Here is the timeline to keep the strategic layers clear. On January 16, 2026, Mark Carney sat down in Beijing with Chinese President Xi Jinping to sign what was officially branded a strategic partnership. The math behind that deal was cold and transactional. Ottawa agreed to slash its import tariff on Chinese-made electric vehicles from a staggering 100% down to just 6.1%. Matching the most favoured nation rate Canada extends to other global trading partners. In direct exchange, Beijing agreed to dismantle the economic blockade it had erected against Canadian agriculture. Specifically, China agreed to slash its combined tariff on Canadian canola seed from 85% back down to roughly 15%, while granting immediate tariff relief to Canadian lobster, crab and seafood exports. The linchpin of the entire arrangement was a hard domestic ceiling: 49,000 vehicles. That is the exact number Carney referenced in Evian. It represents under 3% of Canada's annual domestic auto market of approximately 1.6 million vehicles. The strategy was obvious: create an entry point small enough to defend to skeptics in Washington, but substantial enough to satisfy Beijing's demand for real market access. The official story from Washington was immediate fury. On January 17, before the ink in Beijing was even dry, Donald Trump issued a sweeping public warning, threatening a blanket 100% tariff on all Canadian goods crossing the border if Ottawa proceeded. Over the next 5 months, a coordinated chorus of American officials took turns escalating the rhetoric. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on national television to declare that the United States would never allow Canada to become a backdoor conduit for Chinese manufacturing. US Trade Representative Jameson Greer labelled the deal highly problematic, explicitly warning that Canada would live to regret it. Transportation Secretary Sean Duffy echoed the exact same ominous warning. On Capitol Hill, the condemnation cut completely across party lines. Democratic Senator Brian Schatz claimed the United States had been absolutely rolled by Ottawa, while Republican Senator Bernie Moreno of Ohio delivered a fiery public pledge, stating that as long as he had air in his body, no Chinese vehicles would be sold in the United States, period. That was the public record. 5 months of unrelenting threats, bipartisan outrage, and promises of economic retaliation that could cripple a country that sends 75% of its exports south of the border. But that is the public theatre. Here is the other half that most mainstream coverage completely missed. While the American cabinet was deploying maximum rhetorical pressure, the actual signals from the top were completely different. Back in January, during the World Economic Forum in Davos, Trump had already quietly exposed his true thinking. When asked by Canadian journalists about Carney's outreach to Beijing, Trump casually remarked, "That's what he should be doing. It's a good thing for him to sign a trade deal. If you can get a deal with China, you should do that." That comment was buried beneath more sensational headlines at the time, but it was the real signal. The threats were leverage. The private assessment was pragmatic. When Carney leaned over that table in Evian, he wasn't offering a diplomatic apology. He was acting as a salesman, delivering the final paperwork to a client who already knew the numbers. "I thought you'd actually like that," is a phrase built on a baseline assumption of approval. It confirms that behind the wall of aggressive tweets and hostile cable news appearances, the structural mechanics of Canada's EV cap had already been discussed and accepted. Carney later confirmed to reporters that this was their third conversation on the matter, noting with an insider's edge that he wasn't surprised the president didn't follow every public detail his own administration was putting out. For Canada, the stakes of this theatre could not be higher. This friction isn't happening in a vacuum. It is unfolding as the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement faces its mandatory joint review, legally required before July 1, 2026. Trump has already repeatedly floated the idea of scrapping the USMCA entirely, stating publicly that the US might be better off without it. Because 94% of Canada's domestic automotive production is built directly for US buyers, even a minor disruption in the integrated supply chain is an existential threat to the Canadian economy. This explains the sheer intensity of the domestic backlash inside Canada. Ontario Premier Doug Ford immediately labelled the incoming Chinese imports spy cars, warning that Beijing had successfully secured a strategic foothold in the North American industrial core. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre slammed the Liberal government, calling the vehicles roving surveillance systems, and questioning how the Prime Minister could square this deal with his own intelligence agencies, labelling China a primary national security threat. Unifor President Lana Payne, representing tens of thousands of Canadian auto workers, declared that Ottawa had placed domestic manufacturing at its weakest point in modern history. Even Canada's Public Safety Minister, Gary Anandasangari, was forced to admit that the government would have to install custom digital safeguards to prevent the vehicles from broadcasting domestic data back to servers in Beijing. So, why did Carney risk it? Why forge ahead with a deal that alienated the Detroit 3 automakers, triggered deep anxiety across the Canadian labour movement, and invited public threats of economic annihilation from the United States? The answer sits entirely inside the broader diversification doctrine Carney articulated at Davos on January 20th. In a speech that received a standing ovation from global leaders, Carney warned that the rules-based international order had suffered a fundamental rupture. He argued that middle powers could no longer afford total structural dependence on a single, increasingly volatile superpower that uses tariffs as blunt instruments of domestic politics. His core thesis was clear: middle powers must act collectively to build alternative supply lines, because if you are not at the table, you are on the menu. The China deal is the first real-world application of that doctrine. It was a calculated gamble that Canada could trade a strictly capped 3% sliver of its auto market to secure the financial survival of its multi-billion-dollar agricultural and seafood sectors. The hot mic in Evian proves that as a tactical gamble, the strategy worked. It stripped away the layer of Washington's public bluff, showing that a hard, structural cap was exactly the kind of transactional math Donald Trump respects. But while the theatre has been exposed, the structural danger to Canadian sovereignty has not disappeared. Proving that an American president's public anger is a political performance does not change the cold reality of Canadian economic vulnerability. The USMCA review deadline is still advancing. The security concerns regarding connected vehicle data remain deeply unresolved across the continent, and America's bipartisan protectionist shift exists entirely independent of any single conversation at a G7 lunch. Carney successfully called Washington's bluff on a 11-second audio clip, but the broader chess game for Canada's economic independence is only just beginning. Because while Trump may like the structure of a 49,000 vehicle cap, the deeper, far more consequential question of how Washington will exploit Canada's newly exposed vulnerability during the upcoming USMCA renegotiations remains entirely unanswered. But the most consequential question remains unanswered. To understand how Washington intends to exploit that vulnerability, we have to look past the political theatre and dissect the actual mechanics of what Mark Carney signed in Beijing. This is not a generalized memorandum of understanding. It is a highly technical, asymmetric trade blueprint structured around deep economic trade-offs. The architecture of this arrangement reveals exactly how the Canadian government attempted to balance its acute agricultural vulnerabilities against its domestic manufacturing commitments. The terms of the Canada-China Economic and Trade Cooperation Roadmap run along three distinct structural axes, each carrying precise financial and regulatory conditions. First, the agreement establishes a strict, dual-layered tariff and quota framework for automotive imports that permanently replaces the blanket protections enacted in 2024. Under the baseline terms, Canada formally exempts Chinese-manufactured electric vehicles from the previous 100% surtax, reverting instead to its standard most favoured nation tariff rate of 6.1%. However, this lower rate is strictly bound to an initial annual import quota of 49,000 units for the current year. Any vehicle entering the country past that 49,000 threshold triggers the immediate reinstatement of the full, punitive 100% duty. Crucially, the roadmap contains a built-in escalatory escalator. This quota expands by a fixed 6.5% annually over a 5-year period, legally obligating Canada to accept up to 67,000 vehicles per year by 2031. To soothe domestic anxieties, Ottawa negotiated a specific pricing floor, indexing the quota so that over half of the allocated imports must consist of low-cost models with an import price below 35,000 Canadian dollars. Explicitly targeting the entry-level consumer market where domestic manufacturers currently offer no competing products. www.automotivelogistics.media Yashore 3 second. The deal triggers an immediate unwinding of China's multi-billion-dollar retaliatory blockade on Canadian agri-food exports. The immediate priority for Canadian negotiators was salvaging the domestic canola sector, which had been paralysed after Beijing slapped Canadian seed shipments with an anti-dumping investigation and an 85% combined tariff barrier, causing a 10.4% collapse in bilateral commodity trade over the preceding fiscal year. Under the new terms, China slashed that combined seed tariff back down to a predictable 15%. Furthermore, the deal explicitly removes all non-tariff anti-discrimination duties and administrative licensing delays on Canadian canola meal, peas, lobsters and crabs through at least the end of December. Federal trade registries indicate that this structural reset immediately unlocks an estimated 3 billion Canadian dollars in new, high-margin export orders across Western Canada and the Atlantic seafood sectors, effectively transferring the economic relief directly to rural and coastal ridings. Globalnews.ca, Shore 3/3. The roadmap introduces a controversial, time-sensitive industrial investment mandate designed to force Chinese capital directly into the Canadian domestic supply chain. The architecture does not permit a pure import model indefinitely. Instead, the agreement stipulates that within 36 months of ratification, Chinese automotive manufacturers utilizing the quota must establish operational joint venture industrial footprints inside Canada alongside domestic corporate partners. These mandates explicitly target the midstream and downstream sectors of the green transition ecosystem, requiring localized capital deployment in battery cell assembly, pack integration, and local engineering facilities. By forcing companies like BYD or Geely to transition from simple maritime exporters to domestic employers, the Carney administration is attempting to build an industrial firewall, betting that localized manufacturing investments will eventually pacify the powerful auto unions in Ontario and present a defensible, job-creating asset to skeptical regulators in Washington. w.pm.she.ca issue. What this means is that Canada has effectively traded structural access to its domestic automotive consumer market to secure immediate cash flow survival for its agricultural base. This is the raw reality of middle power diplomacy in a fractured global trade environment. By codifying a rigid 3% market cap on vehicles, Ottawa believed it had engineered a brilliant compromise, a sector-specific deal tight enough to manage without detonating its broader relationship with the United States, yet commercially meaningful enough to buy peace with its second-largest global trading partner. The Walrus.ca. But this granular technical architecture introduces a deeper structural paradox. By carving out a highly specific, quota-managed exception for Chinese technology within the tightly integrated North American economic zone, the Canadian government didn't just alter its tariff schedules. It altered its geopolitical risk profile. The true vulnerability of this architecture doesn't lie in the 49,000 cars entering Canadian ports this year, nor does it lie in the immediate $3 billion windfall returning to prairie farmers. It lies in the hard regulatory timeline established by the deal itself, which forces an aggressive collision course with the legal mechanisms of continental defence. While Canadian officials celebrated the technical precision of their quotas, they systematically overlooked how a treaty built on Chinese joint venture mandates would read to the enforcement mechanisms of the United States trade apparatus. Ultimately, the technical precision of Canada's 49,000 vehicle quota serves as a fragile tactical bridge, engineered to revive billions in domestic agricultural revenue while trying to artificially manage continent-wide protectionist pressures. But when you zoom out to the broader strategic horizon, this 11-second hot mic in Evian reveals a much larger structural transformation in the global trade ecosystem. The most critical implication is that the era of predictable, rule-bound middle power diplomacy is entirely over. In the pre-Trump era, trade policy was governed by multilateral treaties, stable institutions, and predictable, rule-governed dispute mechanisms. Today, international commerce is defined by raw leverage, transaction-by-transaction arrangements, and highly personalized political theatre. By bypassing official channels and speaking directly to the president over a lunch table, Mark Carney demonstrated an astute understanding of this structural shift, acknowledging that in the current Washington landscape, a personal nod from the executive carries far more immediate weight than any institutional framework. For Canada-US relations, this moment signals that while technical compromises are achievable, Ottawa's systemic vulnerability remains acute. Canada cannot escape its geography. Sending 75% of its exports to a single market means that any sovereign attempt to diversify, such as the automotive agreement with Beijing, will constantly be scrutinized through the lens of American national security. The bipartisan consensus in Washington, stretching from Donald Trump's inner circle to regional industrial leaders like Senator Elissa Slotkin, views the influx of Chinese automotive technology not as a simple tariff debate, but as a core cybersecurity and supply chain threat. No matter how much the president likes a 3% domestic market cap in a private conversation, the structural machinery of the American trade apparatus is still legally configured to protect its integrated manufacturing core. Furthermore, this arrangement serves as the first concrete validation of the Davos Doctrine, illustrating how middle powers are being forced to navigate an increasingly fragmented global order. Faced with an unpredictable superpower to the south, Canada deliberately chose to absorb severe political friction at home and risk industrial irritation within the Detroit 3 supply chains to prevent the complete insolvency of its Western agricultural base. This is the blueprint for the next decade of middle power survival, executing asymmetric short-term trade-offs between rival superpowers to maintain basic economic sovereignty. The next critical juncture on the global chessboard is already rapidly approaching. The United States-Mexico-Canada agreement faces its mandatory, legally binding review deadline before July 1st, and Washington has already repeatedly made clear that a full status quo renewal is not guaranteed. The most consequential question moving forward is whether the Carney administration can successfully convert Trump's fleeting private validation in Evian